Hello. Last week, we looked at 七步诗, seven-step poem, a poem written about 500 years earlier than the prime Tang period, and has some idea about the difference between poems written during these periods. Today, we're going even further back to around 200 BC, another 400 years before Cao Zhi, who wrote 七步诗. That's the beginning of the Han Dynasty. Again, let's have a brief look at the history first. We said last time that between Cao Zhi and Tang Dynasty, so this is where Cao Zhi was, and this is the Tang, there were quite a few dynasties in between, as shown in the diagram. Now, before these three kingdoms, when Cao Zhi lived, it was pretty much the Han Dynasty for 400 years. It was split into two halves, West Han and East Han. Emerged after the Qing Dynasty, the first empire of China, though very short-lived, lasting only a couple of decades. And before Qing, we have the periods of warring states and spring and autumn, etc. At the end of the Qing Dynasty, there were many rebels and warlords who were trying to overthrow the Qing Empire and claim the throne of China. Among them, the two most prominent leaders were Xiang Yu and Liu Bang. They were allies in the beginning, working together to fight the Qing dynasty, and then became rivals until they had to face each other in the final years. Xiang Yu for a while was a master and had an absolute upper hand. In fact, he even proclaimed himself to be the new emperor of a new dynasty, West Chu, we call Xi Chu, and had every opportunity to kill Liu Bang, but he didn't. But due to many reasons, he gradually lost the advantage until he had to fight a decisive battle against Liu Bang. But he fell into a trap at a place called Gaixia, which is the current day of Anhui province. At the Battle of Gaixia, Xiang Yu was overwhelmingly defeated and suffered irreparable loss. It was obvious that he had totally lost in this rivalry, and his ending was near. It was at this moment that Xiang Yu composed this poem. He was not a poet per se, but presumably as a great hero, he must have harbored some strong emotions, and such emotion just gushed out under the most difficult, disappointing, and distressful time, making this a highly emotional and truthful poem. Its title is 垓下歌. Gaixia is obviously the battle place, and 歌 means song. We mentioned before that the ancient Chinese poetry tradition had its root deeply in folk songs. Most of the earlier poems can be sung, and the distinction is very vague between a poem as we see it and lyrics of a song. That's why this poem's title is actually 歌. It's a song. It was sung by Xiang Yu on the occasion. Let's read the poem first. 力拔山兮气盖世，时不利兮骓不逝，骓不逝兮可奈何，虞兮虞兮奈若何. Before we explain this poem, let's first have a look at this character, this Xi. I think from our reading out just now, we can all agree that this poem feels somewhat different from what we saw in the past. For one, it does feel more like a song, with quite a few things keeping repeating. And this Xi occurred 5 times in this 28-character poem. This Xi is actually only serving as an interjection word. It has no real meaning, but is a separator for the reader or the singer to take a rest before moving on to the next phrase. It can be vaguely translated as oh or ah or and. It's just a syllable to add tonal and rhythmic variety to the poem, or you can see it as a comma. So when we read the poem, for example, we can naturally pause at this 兮 like this. 力拔山兮气盖世，时不利兮骓不逝，骓不逝兮可奈何，虞兮虞兮奈若何。You see, because of this, it feels more like a folk song rather than a cleverly structured and elaborate work. In fact, you will find that poetry written around this era and much earlier, all the way to the very beginning, when poems originated, almost always sounded like this. You will find many poems use this 兮 character, and if not, would use some other interjections. This is probably one of the biggest differences in terms of form between earlier Chinese poetry, such as this one, and more mature poems later, such as the Tang poems that we are quite familiar with. Now let's look at what the poem is about. 力 is strength. 拔 is to pull. 山 is mountains. 气 means spirit or courage. 盖 means the lid, but here this is a verb, like a lid to cover. What does it cover? 世 is 世界, the world. So this line, Xiang Yu was talking about himself. His strength is so big, he can pull out the mountain. And his spirit is so upbeat, it can cover the whole world. Or his spirit tops the world. This starting line is genuinely magnificent and heroic. With exaggerations, Xiang Yu depicted himself to be such a great man. And indeed he was. He had achieved such big accomplishments, defeating the gigantic Qing Empire, and for a while became the most powerful man in China. But that was all in the past. Now that he lost this key battle, this heroism looked more tragic. And he said, 时不利兮骓不逝. 时 is the time, the situation. 不 is not. 利 is favorable too. So he said, but the time, the situation does not favor me, referring to the fact that he had lost the battle in Gaixia. 骓 means some very fine horse. Xiang Yu had one of such fine horses, but even this horse was not moving forward at this time. 逝 means to go, to pass. There is a profound sadness and desperation in this line, contrasted with the huge pride he had shown in the first line. The next line shows more of the folk song-like quality of this poem. It repeats certain phrases, and in this case, 骓不逝. So that's repeated. 可 means can, be able to do something. 奈 is to do with, to do about. And 何 means what. So 可奈何 basically means what can be done about things, whatever things can be done. We have an idiom or 成语 we call 无可奈何. It's 无可奈何, meaning being helpless, can do nothing about certain things. So in this line, Xiang Yu was saying, following the previous line, now the time does not favor me, and even my fine horse is not carrying me forward. What can be done? What is left to be done? You see, this saddening feeling had deepened, and Xiang Yu had grown even more pessimistic. But he finished his song with even more desperation. Yu was a name of his favorite and most loyal girl or wife. Here, 若 means you, and 奈若何 means what to do with you. Xiang Yu was saying, oh, my Yu girl, what am I to do with you? Even though I am such a hero, now that I've lost this war, what can I do? What can I do with you? This repeated phrases, this 可奈何 and 奈若何, this 虞兮 and 虞兮, like a song, indeed help to brew that sentiment of grief and despair. And according to the history book, Xiang Yu sang this song or poem quite a few times, bursting into tears, and everyone around him was also weeping, including the Yu girl, the Yu, who stayed with him till the end before she killed him herself. The whole thing is a tragedy. Even to this day, after more than 2,000 years, when we read it, we could still sense the intense hopelessness and helplessness that were in the poem. This poem is very short, but even so, even with repeated words and phrases, does appear so full and rich, perfectly catching and expressing the spirit that Xiang Yu was in at the time. Now, Xiang Yu would try to break from the siege the next day, and indeed managed to do so. But when he got to a river, he refused to cross it with a single boat available there to save his life, but instead killed himself because he was too ashamed to go back to face his folks. The story about the rivalry between Xiang Yu and Liu Bang, and in particular, the tragic but heroic fall of Xiang Yu, has been one of the most dramatic and moving episodes of the ancient Chinese history. Countless poems, music, and dramas were set around this topic, and I hope we would find some time later to learn some of the best poems written on this subject. After the Battle of Gaixia, Liu Bang then established the Han Dynasty, which set many foundations of the modern-day Chinese culture and traditions, and that's the reason Chinese people and language are now called Han. That's all for today. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.